About 15 years ago, I decided to be a carpenter. To get a job, you usually had to tell the boss that you knew how to do everything, but I didn't. I knew that I had to build a stairs sometime soon. I ended up building that set from a book I kept out in my pickup. The stairs worked out all right, but it sure took a lot longer than it should have. Since then, I've built a lot of stairs, and I've learned a little bit more on each one of them. Stair building is often thought of as a mysterious craft, but it really isn't, and there's no reason to have someone else build your stairs. I hope this tape and the book I've written help you out. Hi, I'm Scott Schuttner, and I'm a home builder and woodworker in Fairbanks, Alaska. And in this tape and book, I want to show you some techniques for building basic stairways. I'm in a friend's shop where I built some mock-ups of interior partition walls. I've used standard construction techniques such as 2x4 pre-cuts, double top plates, and I framed the stairwell with 2x10 floor joists and used 3/4 plywood for the subfloor. Our first stairway will be a straight run. It'll begin down here, ascend up this wall here like this, and butt into that header up there. I want you to pretend that we've built a 2x4 partition wall here also, so that our stairway will actually be coming up between two partition walls. We've left this wall out so you can see the construction details better. On this other mock-up over here, I've used the same construction techniques such as pre-cut studs and 2x10s, but instead of a straight run, we're going to build an L-shaped stairway. It'll begin here, rise to a platform landing here, and have a short flight from the landing to the second story. This is a model of our first stairway, and it's a straight run, as I said before. It's typical of a stairway in modern construction in that we've used plywood for the risers and treads, and it'll eventually be covered with carpet. These three boards represent 2x12s and are called cut carriages, and they're notched to support our risers and our treads. This board over here is called a stringer or a skirt board, and we are going to butt our treads and risers into this board. There's also some other construction details, such as how we attach the carriages at the top and at the bottom, which I'll show you as we get to the full-scale stairway. When I first started building stairways, I spent a lot of time poring over books and charts, trying to figure out how to cut these notches in the carriages. But after many years, I've realized that there's only one or two critical measurements we need in order to make all these calculations. The first and most important is the vertical distance from finished floor to finished floor, and this is known as the total rise. Our total rise measurement is 107.5 inches. It's also important to check to make sure that the spot where our stairs will end is level with the spot where we've taken our measurement. If not, you'll have to adjust for the difference. Now I'm using the same thickness carpet upstairs as I am downstairs, so I know my 107.5 inch measurement is a finished floor to finished floor distance. But finished floor materials are not the same on both floors all the time. For example, say we use 3/4 inch flooring upstairs, and this was a concrete slab downstairs. We'd have to add 3/4 of an inch to our measurement. If we had 3/4 of an inch oak downstairs and 1/2 inch finished flooring upstairs, we'd have to subtract 1/4 of an inch from our measurement. Now let's do some calculations. I've written down our 107.5 inch measurement here. I know that in a house with a 9-foot measurement from floor to floor, we'll normally have 14 risers. You'll note on our model that I start with a riser and end with a riser. So if I have 14 risers, I'll have 13 treads. I've divided our 107.5 inch measurement by the 14 risers and get 7.678 inches per rise, or 7 11/16. I know this is a comfortable rise, as we should fall somewhere between 7 and 8 inches. A rule of thumb says that the rise plus the run should be between 17 and 18 inches. Our rise of 7 and 11/16 inches, plus a run of 10 inches gives us a number which falls between those two. I've been talking about our rise and our run in terms of notches in this carriage. But if our risers are all the same thickness, our run of 10 inches should be the same when measured from the front of this riser to the front of this riser. In addition to this run of 10 inches, we have an overhang here called a nosing of 1 1/8 inches, which is measured from the front of this riser to the edge of this tread. So our run of 10 inches plus a nosing of 1 1/8 gives us a total tread width of 11 1/8 inches. That's how I calculate for a typical straight run of stairs. You can use these calculations for a short flight or an even longer flight of stairs, long as we stay within a comfortable rise and run. There's more about that in the book. Now, let's lay out some carriages. Finally, I get to use a real piece of wood. I've chosen a nice straight 2x12 that's relatively free of knots. This is a piece of Doug fir, which is one of the strongest framing lumbers we have available locally. Another reason for using a 2x12 is so that I can keep at least 3.5 inches between the point of our notch and the edge of our board. I've set these stair buttons for our calculated rise and run. These stair buttons are great because they'll keep all the triangles the same as I move down the board. If you don't have a set of stair buttons, you can use a 1x4 clamped to the back of your framing square, and that'll work just as well. Since our framing lumber has rounded edges, it's important that these lines intersect the correct point on our framing square, because even a 32nd of an inch error in each notch could equal a 1/2 inch error in the overall length. Now I'll lay out the rest of my notches. Before I show you how to mark the bottom and top of the carriage, let me show you a method that will reassure you that your layout has come out at the right length at the bottom. This method will also help you determine the length of lumber you'll need when buying your carriage material. Remember the old Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared? A is our total rise measured from finished floor to finished floor. B is the total run. That's just the sum of our individual runs of our treads. C is the hypotenuse. This length will give us a way to check our layout from this point to this point. Knowing this length, I can buy my carriage lumber. I always like to buy a foot or so extra on each end in case I have to cut off any splits. Also knowing this length gives me another method for laying out my carriage. I can take this number, divide by 14, the number of my triangles, transfer that length to a pair of dividers, and lay out on the edge of my real 2x12 these points where the triangles intersect the edge of the board. You may have to adjust this dimension a couple times so that you come out at the right spot at the very end. Then I go back with my framing square and draw my lines through those points. This is the top of my carriage, and I've just drawn in the line that represents the finished floor and the line that represents where the carriage will butt into the header. I need to subtract 3/4 of an inch for a hanger board, which will be the means of attaching our carriage to the header. Don't worry, I'll tell you more about the carriage board in a minute. Now I've got my saw lines marked at the top, and I can go finish laying out the bottom. This line I'm going to draw represents my finished floor. And this is an area where people commonly have a problem, and I certainly have had a few too, in that they don't do what is called dropping the carriage. This is a piece of plywood that's the same thickness as I'm going to use for my treads, 1 1/8 inches. You can see when I position this, as if it were a real tread, that the distance from our finished floor line to the top of our tread is greater than our calculated rise. To solve this, I'm going to shorten the height of the first riser by removing the thickness of this tread from the bottom of the carriage. This is now our new finished floor line. And now our bottom riser is the correct height. Dropping the carriage also lowers the top to the correct position. One more thing. I like to anchor my carriages to the subfloor. This line represents our finished floor line and is our cut line since we're using carpet on our stairway. If we had planned on using 3/4 inch oak flooring and had adjusted for this in our total rise calculations, I would want to add the thickness of this flooring to the bottom of my carriage, and this new line would represent our subfloor. I'm using a Skill worm drive saw, which is the same saw used for all my framing. Only here I've put on a 40-tooth carbide blade to get a smooth cut. The first cut I make is for the top tread. And this cut is for where the hanger board attaches to the carriage. You can see I have to hold up the guard with my thumb because the saw is coming at an angle to the board. Don't be tempted to wedge up the guard, because if the saw kicks back you might get cut. This is the cut for the top riser, well on the waist side of the line. And here's the cut for the top tread, also on the waist side of the line. Don't be tempted to let these cuts overlap, as I've seen some carpenters do. They want that chunk to drop out without using a handsaw, but it weakens the carriage. Let me show you what this looks like on the back side. When I'm making my cuts with a handsaw, I want to be sure not to go any further than the imaginary lines. After I finish cutting out the rest of these notches, I use this carriage as a pattern for our other two. Okay, now I've got all the carriages cut, and I'd like to show you a few more details on the model. These little notches in the bottom of the carriage are to slip over this anchor. This will keep the carriages from sliding forward over time. Up here at the top, let me show you how we're going to attach the carriages to the header. This is a hanger board. It's nothing more than a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. We're going to nail the hanger board to the header and then nail our carriages from the back side through the hanger board. This is a good way to attach the carriages, but it's not the only way, and I've got other alternatives in the book. Now, we're going to put up our hanger board. I want this hanger board to be really secure because it holds up all the carriages. For a permanent installation, I'd use 8 or 10 16-penny nails. Now I've nailed down the top of my hanger board, and I want to mark where my carriage goes. I measured down from the top of my finished floor, 7 11/16 inch, and 1 1/8 inch more to the bottom of the tread. This is the top of my cut carriage. Okay, I'm right on my mark, tight against the hanger board. I'm going to temporarily tack this in place so I can make some marks on the studs for a 2x4 spacer board that I'm going to install in a minute. Now I've got my 2x4 spacer in place. I'm going to nail my carriage to that 2x4. This 2x4 creates a nice space here so I can bring my sheetrock in and my finished skirt board when the time comes. I'm nailing through the back of the hanger board into the carriages with some 16-penny nails, 2 into each carriage. If this still doesn't seem like enough, I'll use a metal clip on the front where the carriage meets the hanger board. This is the kickboard I showed you in the model. I'm nailing it down with a couple 16-penny nails. When you do this, try and hit the floor joist instead of just the plywood. You only see me using 2 nails, but 3 or 4 would be better. Since I've cut the kickboard to the right length, all I have to do is slide the carriage to the end of it and nail it in place. Then I center the third carriage and tack it also. Now that I've finished installing the carriages, I'm ready to rip the treads and risers. I set the fence for the width of the tread. I'm using 1.1/8" plywood for these treads, but you could use 3/4 inch stuff. I prefer this though for a sturdier tread. With the treads cut, I set the saw to rip the risers. You don't need to use 1.1/8" plywood for the risers. 3/4 will be fine because no one will be walking on them. And it's really helpful to have a second person to catch the cutoffs. I have to do one more thing before installing these treads. I'm going to ease the edge with a 1-inch diameter round over bit. It's easier to bend the carpet around this soft edge, and it'll last a lot longer. I start with the second riser up. I flush it up with a carriage and tack it in place with a small nail. Then I drill a pilot hole for some screws. The pilot hole is the shank size of the screw. I only have to drill a hole in the plywood because the screw will cut its own threads in the carriage. Just installed our first riser. I've installed it in a good bed of construction adhesive. I'd ripped it to our calculated rise of 7 11/16 inch. I've also got a stack of treads which I'd ripped to our calculated run plus the nosing for 11 1/8. My rough stairwell opening is 38.5 inches, and by the time I put my sheetrock and my skirt boards in, I'll have a 36-inch wide stairway. I've cut the treads a little shorter and the risers so they'll fit easily between the skirt boards. If there's any crack later on, it'll be covered when we carpet the stairway. This is the bottom riser. It's shorter than all the others by the thickness of one tread because it sits directly on the floor, whereas this riser has a tread which laps up onto it. Now I'll install this riser, then a tread, and we'll work our way up the stairway. As you can see, I really believe in this goop. I use it everywhere where wood meets wood. It'll really keep the squeaks down in the future. As with the risers, I flush it up, tack it in place, and sink it tight with sheetrock screws. Now a couple more screws from the back will turn all these pieces into one solid unit. Now that I've installed about half the treads, I thought I'd pop up here and show you a few things. Our hanger board is going to serve as our last riser since we removed 3/4 inch from our carriage when we cut it. Also, when I installed the subfloor, I left it long. Now I'm going to have to cut it to the right width, 1 1/8. I'll also need to put a little notch here for my skirt board, and I'll show you that when we go back to the model. Before I finish the last of our treads and risers, I want to show you a few alternative ways to finish this side of the stairway. If we didn't have a wall here and this was an open stairway, we could notch a finish board like this, just the same as our carriage, and hang our treads and risers over and let the carpet wrap around and butt into that board. We could put up a whole unnotched board like this, just let our treads butt into that. If this was a utility stairs, we might leave this open, although these risers add a lot to the strength of the stairway. If it was a utility stairs, we might use a 2x12 here, and if it was an exterior stairs, we might use a pair of 2x6s out of cedar or something like that. This is the skirt board. My skirt board is going to be a piece of 1x10 clear fir. I chose this width so I'd have at least 2 or 3 inches from the top of my tread to the top of my skirt board. To find the length of this skirt board, I'd put a mark on the sheetrock, which represented the top of my skirt board. I'd also put a mark up here, and I'd extend this down through both points to the floor. Let's call this point A. I'd also extend this line upwards to a point where it intersected with the finished face of my top riser. Then I'd measure from point B to point A and lay that out at the proper angles on my finished skirt board. I'd then lay out the cuts that would be appropriate at the bottom and at the top for the kind of base trim I would be using. Remember I mentioned this notch. I cut this in my subfloor, so my skirt board would slide right in. These are 12-penny finish nails I'm using here, and I'll probably put 1 or 2 in every stud. Now I've just finished installing the skirt board. Normally this wall would be sheetrocked entirely, but I've left an area off so I can show you some blocking which I've put in for our handrail. I've installed this blocking so the top of my handrail will be about 30 inches from the top of this tread, even with the face of this riser. Let me show you some of the types of handrails we might use. This is a piece of pine hand railing with a steel bracket, which we attach to the wall like this. This type of railing also comes in oak, and we could use a cast brass bracket for a dressier installation. I often prefer to make my own railing. This is a piece of clear fir, same type of wood as we have in our skirt board. It's a full 1 inch thick, and I've rounded the edges for smoothness. I've attached a spacer block to the back of the railing, so when I mount it on the wall, there'll be room between the sheetrock and the railing for my hand to slide. Now the stairs are ready for the carpet layer. I want to show you this model of our second stairway so I can explain some of the details of its construction. Our finished floor to finished floor height will be the same as in our first stairway, so our calculations of rise and run will also be the same. Now this is an L-shaped stair, and I'll explain in a minute how this landing just takes the place of one of our steps. In this stairway, instead of plywood for our risers and treads, we'll be using oak. We'll have the same cut carriages, but our carriage on this side will be our skirt board. This will be thicker because I'm going to route mortises to house our risers and treads. The finished skirt board on this side will be mitered to receive our risers. Up here, I've attached the carriages with a hanger board, just like in our first stairway. Up at the top here, I've attached our carriages by butting them into the header. I've also notched the carriage so it can rest on this ledger board. This stairway will have a starting newel and a landing newel. It'll have a handrail and a balustrade. Well, the first place to start with an L-shaped stairway is at the landing, so let's go. I'm marking here for the finished height of the landing. Now I want you to think of this landing as just another tread, except larger. In our staircase, the landing is the 7th tread, and I mark the finished floor height at 7 times the unit rise. For the framing, though, I have to come down 1.5 inches from this mark to account for the 3/4 inch landing subfloor and 3/4 inch oak flooring. I'm using 2x10s for the framing of the landing. And since I'm working alone here, I'll put this landing up piece by piece. If you have help, it'll be easier to build it in one piece on the floor and then nail it in place. This 2x4 is just a temporary leg to hold up the joist while I nail it off. This landing is really nothing more than a big box. You can also see it's not a square but a rectangle, because the carriages of the upper flight rest on one end. I want to frame in some walls underneath this stairway so we can close it off for use as a closet or a bathroom. The place to start is with a bottom plate. Once that's in, I can get a post under the landing and remove the temporary leg. This post is just a doubled 2x4. I'll get it plumb and then toenail it in place. Blocking is one of those things that you never miss until it's not there. I need blocking for baseboard, sheetrock, and skirt boards. The landing gets a layer of plywood right on top of the glue, just like a regular floor. I'm pulling my subfloor out 3/4 of an inch so it'll be flush with my hanger board. Now this hanger board is just like on the straight run stairs. I'll tack it in place and add more nails when I'm sure it's right. I'm positioning this carriage so that when I add a tread, the top of it will be 1 unit rise down from the top of the finished floor of the landing. You can see that this carriage fits pretty well to the hanger board. If yours doesn't, it may be a good time to double check your calculations. Make sure you haven't forgotten anything, such as dropping the carriage. Another common mistake is to forget your finished floor materials which aren't yet in place. You've allowed for them in your calculations, so don't forget them in your measurements. I'm using a level to find the height of the middle carriage. I could measure down like I did for the first one, but this way I'll be sure they'll both line up. I'm putting a few nails through the hanger board into the carriage like I did on our first stairs, but I probably won't use any clips because this is such a short flight. Once again, we're going to use a kickboard at the bottom of this stairs. You can see here that I've only got 2 cut carriages for this stairway. That's because the third one against the wall would be the house skirt board, and it'll be mortised to receive our treads and risers. If this was concrete, you'd have to bolt this down. Time now for the upper flight. I slide the top into place and flush the bottom up with the landing. I really prefer to rest the carriages on the landing rather than butting them into it. You can see that again I've left the plywood subfloor long to act as the top tread. I feel this is really important because it ties the carriages to the framing. I've laid out the carriages for the upper flight the same as I did for the bottom flight. I had to drop them by the thickness of a tread and add for the 3/4 inch finished flooring. Now at the top, instead of a hanger board, I'll be using a ledger board. This is because our carriages butt against the header. This ledger, like a kickboard, will keep our carriages from sliding down. The ledger is beveled, so we can sheetrock flush with the carriages. Now I need to do the framing under the stairway to close this off for a closet. First I put in a top plate so I have something to nail my studs to. I've got layout marks on the bottom plate. Instead of putting them on the top plate, I'll just use my level and mark it in place. This area under the stairs is too good to waste. It's a good spot for a half bath or a closet. It also makes for a nice private space used as a library or just shelving. That ought to do it. Okay, I've finished all the framing and I've left a large hole for access to the underside of the stairway. I've designed this stairs so we'll have 36 inches from the inside of our finished skirt board to the center line of our balustrade. That's from here to here. As you can see, we'll need treads which are a little longer than 36. The placement of our cut carriages was determined by how the finished treads and risers will fit in to the newel post. I put a notch in the subfloor and the hanger board to make installation of the newel post easier later on. An important thing to note is the center line of the balustrade is also the center line of the newel post, and in this case is also even with the front face of our riser. There's a lot more about all these details in the book. And now I'm going to go route the mortises in my skirt board for my finished risers and treads. Okay, I've started laying out my house skirt board. This is the one which will be next to the wall. Into this board I will route my mortises for my risers and my treads. I've drawn this line on the skirt board. I've also drawn that line on my model to show you how my rise and my run will intersect that line when I lay them out with a framing square. These are the same lines of rise and run that were on our cut carriages when this was the top edge of the board. This board is 10.5 inches wide, and I've chosen that width so that I'll have room to route out the entire riser and tread, and still have some room between the top of the nosing and the edge of the board.
Now in the old days, these mortises would require a lot of chisel work, but I'm sure glad I have a router. This 3 horsepower plunge router with a 1/2 inch carbide bit will make short work of these mortises. There are several ways to make jigs to cut these mortises, and here I'm using a base guided jig. A template guided by a bearing over router bit works just as well, and that's in the book. I cut the mortise in several passes to avoid burning. I first follow the perimeter of the mortise and then waste the inside. That's it for one tread mortise. Now for a riser. Now normally I wouldn't switch back and forth between jigs. I would route all the tread mortises and then all the riser mortises.
I've put these scrap pieces in here to test the fit of my mortise. This is a factory laminated red oak tread, and the factory has also rounded the front edge, called the bullnose. The tread comes wide, and I've ripped it to our width of 11 1/8, plus a quarter I've added for the tongue on the back. This tongue will fit into the groove that I've plowed in the front of the riser. I've also plowed a dado on the underside of the tread. The riser fits into this dado, and if there should ever be any shrinkage of the riser, we won't have a crack opening up here. I made these 2 oak wedges on a jig, and in the final installation they'll be glued in place and hold everything tight against the finished face of the mortise. This is what the finished mortise looks like. Let me show you how I add these lines to my original layout so I can make a jig which will cut this mortise. You remember I drew the original lines, run of 10, rise and 7/11/16 with my framing square. Now these lines intersected my base line. I then took a piece of riser material, put it in its correct position, and marked its face on this board. I also did the same with a piece of tread, placed it in its proper position, and marked its face. I then took the wedges, put them in their right place, and marked their profiles. These lines now represent the shape of my mortise. Let me show you how the jig fits. I adjusted the distance from the outside of my mortise to the jig to fit my router. So all I have to do is run my router around the outside edges of this jig, and I'll have my mortise cut. Here's the jig for the riser. There's plans for these jigs in the book. I've made this one to fit my router base, but you'll have to adjust this to fit yours. Be sure to try these out on a piece of scrap because this oak's expensive. Now I'll clamp this down and finish routing my mortises.
Now I have to get rid of all those pencil lines I've made, and I do this with a belt sander. It's a lot easier to sand all those marks off before you get the treads and risers in the way.
Okay, sheetrock's in place. I'm going to drop this guy down, tight against the wall. I'm going to check in a few spots to make sure that this skirt board is going to work. There's a little wiggle there. The wedge will take most of that up, and looks like my kickboard's sticking out a little far. I'll knock that off with a chisel. Might need a shim in the middle, but it looks like it fits pretty good here. test it up a little higher. Fits real well there, so I think we're pretty good in that direction. I'm going to grab a tread. Skirt board's a little high here. Let's try up here. A little high there too. And let's check it with a level. Yeah, skirt needs to come up, the tread needs to come up just a little. Now I have a little gap under my tread, between the tread and this carriage. Maybe I'll stick a little shim under there to bring the center carriage up. There, that's nice and solid. Now I'll screw the skirt board tight to the wall and lay out and cut my mitered skirt board.
I'm using my level to help line up the hole with the studs. And as always, you'll have to drill a pilot hole to get through this oak. I'm keeping my holes on the bottom side of the tread where they won't show. You may need some holes above the treads to hold the skirt board tight, and then you'd have to counterbore and plug them.
Back to the model again so I can show you a few things about how we're going to lay out this skirt board. I've drawn a baseline on this model, much like I did on our other skirt board. And through it, I've drawn my rise and my run. There's a little overhang from the rise line to the edge of the skirt board. This is so I can cut the miter. This will mate with the miter on my riser for a nice clean corner with no end grain. Let me show you how this works on this real board. This is our baseline. And this dimension is important only so that our layout doesn't come off the edge of the board. I've laid out my rise and my run intersecting the baseline. And now I'm going to take a piece of riser and lay out the area that will be mitered. Put it in place. Now I'll cut out the waist with a skill saw and saw the miter with a hand saw.
As you can see, I've clamped the skirt board in place on this sawhorse, so I'll be sawing at waist height instead of on my knees. I'll make the cut with a sharp 12-point cross-cut saw. You can make this cut on a table saw or with a skill saw, but I prefer the hand saw method. The bottom riser gets cut all the way through, but I have to complete the next riser with a seat cut.
Now this is just a scrap of sheetrock. Normally the whole wall would be covered. I'll get one last screw in here. Now I have these blocks which are going to hold my finished skirt board away from the cut carriage. The distance of the sheetrock plus a little bit. I'm going to put 2 or 3 of these blocks along this carriage. Now I'll take my finished skirt board and put it in place temporarily. I'm going to hold it with a clamp until I get it set in the right position. Now a quick check with the level to make sure that my skirt board isn't high. We want the weight to rest here, not here. I'll check the back of the riser and see if it hits the miter in the right spot. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I'll check it with a real riser, though, before I nail this off. I'll check in just a couple more spots here, make sure everything's okay. Now, everything looks pretty good. I've already cut this into the riser square. I'm going to put it into the mortise there. And bring this front face of the skirt board out to the front of my riser. Now I'll go to the table saw and cut that 45. Got the first riser mitered. Fits tight here. Looks like it fits real well out here too. This is the time when you might want to adjust this skirt board this way for a good fit. You can see that the heel of the miter is open a little bit. That's so out here at the toe we'll have a nice tight fit too. I'm using a nail here for a drill bit, which works really well because it's just the right size. Okay. Before I go any further, I'm going to cut a tread to make sure all these parts will go together. I'm going to butt it into this face of the skirt, not into the mortise. Mark my length. Now I'll add a 1/2 inch for the mortise. That's where I'll make my cut. One more thing I have to do before I can test this fit. I have to nick this corner off here so I can get past this edge. It takes a little bit of fiddling to get it in there. Yeah, that fits great there. Okay, I'll fit this riser to this tread. There's my little nicked off corner again. I'll drop this thing into place as a unit. Yeah, when it's wedged, it'll be just right. Let's push the front into place. It doesn't seem to want to go. It must be hitting something in the back. It's loose here. It's hitting this carriage back here. Maybe something's out of square. Yep. We'll have to cut a little bit off with a chisel here to square this carriage up. Little adjustments like this are common. We'll probably have to do a little shimming and cutting on each step to make it work. Well, let's try this unit and see if it fits any better now. Yeah, that goes back there nicely and fits well against that carriage. Now we'll glue the first riser in place.
Once again, I'm using construction adhesive on all my wood-to-wood joints. And be sure to use some on the miter. The nails I'm using here are 6-pennies in pre-drilled holes. I need to wedge this bottom riser into place, and I'm using yellow glue here. Now this is a tough one to wedge because you can't hammer from below. And the last thing I need to do here is a couple finish nails from the front to lock the joint. Once the bottom riser is in place, I can start assembling my treads and risers as a unit. And as a matter of fact, I have to do it this way because there are so many interlocking joints. Now it'll take a bit of wiggling to get this unit in place, but don't take too long or the yellow glue will start to set up. Now it's not critical that your miters meet perfectly, but you want to be close enough so that sandpaper can finish it off. Now these wedges are a little easier to put in because I can get at them with a hammer. And you're right, you don't need to use that much glue. The next thing to do is to fasten down the tread. Now this can be done with large finish nails, but I like to use screws. Later I'll plug them and they won't show.
I'm going to put these glue blocks in place underneath. They'll meet the riser and the tread. You can't follow me under there, but I'll show you when we get a little higher.
And the final step is to run some screws through the back of the riser into the tread.
Now, 1 down, 11 to go. While I'm resting my knees, I want to show you this piece of the model I brought over here to explain how this tread will be different than the first one. This one was cut off flush with the edge of the skirt. I'll put a nosing on here later. This part will be covered by the newel. This is the nosing, and it fits on the tread like that. This is actually a better example of the second tread. I'll get my cut line across here and lay out a 45. I'll saw the cut with a table saw and hand saw the 45. Then I'll put the nosing on later. The width of the nosing, the overhang, is the same as the overhang was on the front. Put the tread tight against the house skirt board. Make a mark flush with the edge of this skirt board. Now I need to add a 1/2 inch for the housing and 1 1/8 inch for the return nosing. I'll square these marks across. This is a cut mark. This is where the edge of the return nosing will be. I'm taking that out to the corner so I know where to saw my miter. Now I'll lay out the 45 from that mark. Saw this with a table saw and this with a hand saw. This is some of that planing and fitting I was talking about. I tried this nosing, I tried its fit into the mortise, and it was a little tight, so I've taken a few shavings off so it'll fit better. As you can see, I've made a unit out of this one. Assembled the riser to the tread and put the screws and glue in already. Now let's try our fit. Yeah, that's real good. It fits over here too. Now I'll take it out and glue it in place. Oh, that fits really great. Nice and tight. It's really starting to look pretty good. Takes care of number 2. Now I'll install the third step, and then I'll show you how to install the return nosing. Okay, the third one's in place. I've brought this piece of return nosing, which I've ripped off an extra tread. I've cut a 45 on it to mate with a 45 from my tread. I still have to cut it to length, though. It's a little long. I'm going to mark it in place. To do this, I'll make a mark at the front face of my riser, and then I'll cut a 45 like this. Then I'll add a little piece in here which will butt into the finished skirt. Now that I've got it cut to length, I'm going to use a little glue to help hold it on. I'm using construction adhesive instead of yellow glue because this is a piece of cross-grain construction, and as this tread moves, it would break the glue bond if we were using yellow glue. Now to make this little piece, I've cut a 45 on this piece of molding. I'm going to mark its length in place instead of using a tape measure. Now, when I cut this square, the little piece will fit. I'm going to use yellow glue instead of construction adhesive on this little piece because I have a pretty nice fit. I'm going to use tape because a little finish nail might split this piece. There, we'll just leave that there until the glue dries. Working on the return nosing for the second tread. I'm doing this one a little differently, and I'll show you just a minute how I'm rounding over this edge instead of cutting that little piece. On the first half of the stairway, I use pretty traditional methods for stair building. On the second half, we'll simply be butting our treads and risers into the skirt board. I've added a third carriage for support since we won't be routing mortises. Also, in this method, you might use a thinner skirt board. I've also put a spacer in here to pull this carriage away from the skirt board. And I've screwed this carriage tightly to the skirt board so we won't have any cracks opening at our butt joint later on. Let me show you how we scribe these risers now. As you can see, we have a gap at the bottom, but we're tight at the top. I'm just going to take my pencil, holding it tight against the skirt board, draw a line from top to bottom. Now when I cut that line, we should have a good tight fit. First thing I'm going to do is check this line I've scribed for square, and it's not square. If it were, I could make this cut without any adjustments. Since it's not square, I'm going to have to tilt this board a little off of 90 degrees. Now when I run it through the saw, it should follow that line. Let's try its fit. Oh, that looks great. Now I can mark the length and cut this miter. Set this last nail here. It's a good idea to check every once in a while, make sure things are still on track. We still have our 10-inch run there, and there, and there. It's right on. Now you can remember I had a groove in this riser on the first 3 steps, and that fit with the tongue from the tread. On these stairs, or steps, we're just going to butt the tread into the riser and rely on the glue and screws from the back to keep this joint tight.
First I'll cut my tread to length, then I'll plow my dado. These marks keep me from sawing too far. The riser fits into this dado.
I'm going to mark in place where my dado has to stop. And I'm going to chisel out what I couldn't do on the table saw. Now I need to mark its length. Since we don't have any return nosing on this one, I'll mark flush with my finished skirt board and add the 1.1" for the nosing. Now I'll draw a line that's square. This is where I'll cut with my table saw.
After it's cut, I need to route the end of the tread to the same profile that's on the front. To do this, I'm using a 1-inch diameter roundover bit. To make the rounded edge, I make a pass on both top and bottom. Now a belt sander will make short work out of any burn marks on end grain. And a few strokes with a sanding block will finish it off. Now even though there's no tongue and groove joint here, I still need to use glue. And of course I wipe it all over the place if I don't know what else to do with it. I slip the tread over the riser, and then I have to secure it in place. I use 2.5-inch sheetrock screws at both ends because I don't have a wedged mortise to hold it in place.
Okay, it's a little crowded under here with all of us, but I'm going to try and show you where we put these glue blocks. These will keep the stairs from squeaking in time. Right at the corner of the riser and the tread, sink it in with a screw. One on the other side too. Well, I finished that one, and a lot of people, including myself, prefer the simpler lines of this method. We have no return nosing here, as we did on this step. Sometimes this return nosing is necessary if we're going to house our balusters. Since I'll be using dowels in my balusters, it wasn't necessary. Well, I've installed all but the last tread and riser, and I need the landing newel in place before I can do those. I thought it might make more sense to come down and take a look at this newel first, though. As you can see, I've cut a notch in the bottom of this newel and also a notch in the corner of this tread. This way, the newel will fit over this corner and make for a really sturdy installation. Whenever possible, I like to let the newel through the subfloor down into the floor framing. This will help make an extra sturdy installation. Of course, the size of these notches will have to be made for your stairway, but just remember the center line of the balustrade must line up with the center line of the newel, and here that is centered over the skirt board. I've made this newel post by gluing two boards together. That should help keep it from twisting in the future. I've chamfered all the corners and also put a bevel up here at the top. That's good and snug. Now, I've made the counterbores straight so my plugs will still fit, but I'm putting the lag bolt in at an angle so I can catch some of the wood inside the carriage. That will give those threads something to bite into. There, that's tight. That's close enough, and side looks pretty good too. Solid. Well, I've beveled the top and chamfered the edges of this post, just like on the other one. I've also put a piece of sheetrock in place. Now these notches may look complicated, but I believe if you take it one notch at a time and do your layout in place, you won't have any problems. I'm going to slide this over into its final position. You can see the center line of our newel post has lined up with the center of our skirt board. The same is true on this side. Now, if I was putting this finished skirt board in, I'd also have to mortise a housing for it. I don't have to put my lags in from the front on this post. I've already drilled my holes. All I have to do is install them from the back, and then I can finish the tread and the riser. Well, that seats our last tread and riser. All that's left is this piece of transition tread. It's full thickness in the front, and I've cut it down to 3/4 of an inch in the back. I've put a groove in it to mate with the tongue from the flooring. It goes in place just like a regular tread. Now I'll just screw that down and it'll be finished. Well, we're done with the risers and treads. The newel posts are in place, and all we have to do is bridge the two. I've got a piece of hand railing here that we're going to use. I've cut a little profile of this hand railing where my fingers are going to slide. I've made those round grooves with this cove bit in my router table. I've also plowed a groove in the bottom of the handrail to accept the tops of the balusters. Now, using my miter box and my bevel gauge, I've already cut the bottom of this piece of railing at the right angle. I'm going to butt it into the post, and setting it on top of all these nosings, I'll mark its length in place. Now, if our newels are plumb, this railing should fit in its correct position. Now that I've cut it to length, let me show you how I arrived at its position. Down here is a mark. That represents the front face of my riser, and it's centered on our newel post. I've transferred that line up to the top here, 30 inches from the top of the tread. Then with my bevel gauge, I've marked the angle of the railing and brought that line around square to the front, and that's where it sits. I also did the same thing at the top. Now I'll run a few screws from the bottom side of the railing into the newel and at the top, and they'll be ready for balusters. A lot of guys use rail bolts for this connection, but if you don't have one, these lags work pretty well. You can see this landing newel has to be a lot taller than the starting newel because this railing for the second flight is going to start way up here. Now on to the balusters. Okay, I put a little dab of glue in the hole where the dowel goes. Another dab of glue on the top where the cut is. Now squeeze that down into its place. Drill a couple holes where the nails go. Set them. Now, before I put this last piece of nosing in place, I'd like to show you what its traditional use was. I've dovetailed the bottom of this baluster, and traditionally the tread was notched to receive this dovetail. Then the nosing covered the notch and the dovetail. Nowadays the nosing is more decorative than functional. It's pretty common these days to put a dowel in the end of our balusters. Then we drill a hole in the tread and the dowel seats in the hole. The layout of the balusters is really quite simple. The front face of the first baluster for each tread is even with the riser. So the front face for the second baluster is centered between these two risers. I just measure back from that front face mark half the distance of my baluster and in 3/8, which is centered over the skirt board and is the center line of my balustrade.
I'm using a 1/2-inch bit to drill out the dowel holes, and I've stuck on a piece of tape as a depth gauge. The dowels are birch. 1 inch is inserted into a hole in the end of the baluster and 1 inch into the tread.
Put it in place, even with my front edge mark. And with my level, I'll hold it plumb. Make a mark even with the bottom of the railing, and then I'll add a little extra so it can be housed in the underside. And that's where I'll cut. Just right. Well, 2 down, 9 to go. Well, that's the last of the balusters. The only piece left is this little filler block. It's beveled on both ends. Fits between the balusters up in this groove. It'll lock the balusters in place. A couple finish nails to hold it. You might want to note that we have 2 different lengths of balusters. The pair for each step starts at the tread, comes up, but the back one has to go further to meet the railing. The chamfers are also a different length. They start at the bottom, even with the next step up and rise. The back one is longer. This gives us a nice step motion for the bottom of our chamfers and makes the top chamfers parallel with the railing. Yeah, that's good. I've just put this piece of cold molding in place. The far end of this front piece butts into the skirt board. We have a miter here at this corner. And on the back end of this little piece, I've shaped the same profile that we have on the front here. You might remember that I told you to hold this skirt board down so the treads would rest on the carriage. And that leaves a crack here. This cold molding gives us a chance to cover it. After I finish this cold molding, about the only woodworking left to do would be maybe to put a piece of trim here where the skirt board meets the sheetrock. Or maybe a piece of trim here where this skirt board meets the sheetrock. After that, I'll plug the screw holes, fill the nail holes and any cracks I might have left, give it a good finish sanding, and maybe a couple coats of varnish. Now, although you've seen this stairway take an hour or less on this tape, it would take me a week or 2 from start to finish. Now, I know your house will have its own special shaped stairway, and whether you choose the simpler one, like our straight run, or a more complicated one, like this L-shaped one, the principles I've shown you will still work. Don't be afraid to give it a try.